Welcome to the Foundation's Constitution at Work podcast. Today, we continue our discussion on electoral reform. This is South Africa's fifth time around the wheel of whether or not we should reform our current electoral system. Currently, we have the proportional system, which ensures a lot of fairness and minority voices being heard. But we completely throw out any direct link between voters and the MPs because the MPs are rather directly linked to the party. And that has led to a whole host of problems. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, the Constitutional Rights Program Manager at the FW de Klerk Foundation. And I am joined by esteemed guests, Mmusi Maimane, Michael Atkins, as well as some of the Foundation's staff, Ismail Joosub, and our intern, Alfred Maimane.
Hello, everybody. It's Mmusi Maimane, leader of Build One South Africa and the chair of the Standing Committee on Appropriations.
Hi, I'm Michael Atkins. I've had a long involvement in elections, looking at the accuracy of results going back to the 99 elections. And in recent years, have made several submissions on electoral reform to Parliament. And I had the privilege of being involved in the constitutional court cases last year, looking at how to fill vacancies under the new system and the fairness of the calculations for independent candidates.
And I am Ismail Joosub, Manager of Constitutional Advancement at the FW de Klerk Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alfred Maimane, an intern at FW de Klerk under Daniela Ellerbeck.
I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. So, Mmusi, why don't you start us off with the current electoral system and the advantages and disadvantages of it that you see from a political party perspective?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. And we really have to amend our electoral system because our failure to do so means that politicians fear only parties, swear allegiance to parties, take mandate from chief whips rather than taking mandate from the people, bearing allegiance to the Constitution and knowing that for them as political principle, they must fear the citizens ahead of anyone else. The question about whether is it not time to elect people directly or to think about a different model of elections. And President Ramaphosa, in his submissions, made the point to say South Africa is an anomaly in how it conducts its own elections relative to SADC and other parts of Africa. So this is an ongoing conversation. The second thing is our current framework for how members of parliament operate were really designed for a different electoral system. The current model as we have it relies wholly on proportional representation and therefore are significantly favoring of political parties. It's why I think the Constitutional Court ruled that if indeed you have a freedom of association with a political party, you also have a freedom of disassociation, which then meant that, in essence, anyone who wants to stand for public representation must, in some instances, or can do it via a political party or can do it as an individual. But that wasn't the only destination we wanted to go for. The destination really was the reform of the electoral system to make it possible that actually, if an individual were to stand, even if that individual was affiliated to a political party, that they needed to account to a constituency. And so we hold the absolute view, as have people like Van Zyl Slabbert and many others, that there needs to be a constituency-based model. That ultimately the system can't just rely wholly on proportionality in that all seats must be split up by number of votes per party, but that you could have at least a number of members of parliament being directly elected by the citizens in a constituency. And we extend it further to say we think the president must do likewise, that there must be a direct election of the president. Now, the modalities, I'm sure people like Michael Atkins would tell you a little bit more about. Actually, you could have 350 members being elected directly in a constituency-based model and 50 proportionally, or you could have 300, 100. The numbers, there's been proposals of 200, 200. There's another school of thought that speaks about multi-member constituencies, which says that at least if you live in a particular city or a particular province, you could have multiple members representing you in that constituency. I think for me, without getting into the technical weeds of the issue, I'd want to highlight just these principles. The first is democracy relies on two axes, if you like. On one level, you give mandate to someone. On another level, you need all the powers to curb the excesses of that mandate. So if you give if you elect someone, the national constitution says only the national government can deal with matters such as healthcare, education, more specifically the SAPs. These are concurrent functions between national and provincial. Therefore, a person who is elected to represent you must be able to account on those. No ward councillor can do it, no mayor can do it, just the member of parliament, because they have to come to parliament and deal with that. So on the first instance, let's create constituencies where members of parliament could come and account. The second is, let us directly elect them so that we know who they are. Even if it's member X from party Y, at least we know what the relationship between those two things are, and we know who the person is, so that when water is no longer flowing, the lights are off, or schools don't work, or police are not showing up, you know who to talk to. And then the third component is that Parliament itself has established a principle where it's called Constituency Week, so that members of Parliament can go and do precisely that. Go into communities and do it. It's already in practice now. And then lastly, if you are going to directly elect the president, let's make sure that that president at least enjoys a mandate from the people, not exclusively from the party, because as we have seen historically in the last 30 years, is that when the party has had enough of the leader, they pull the person out, which means the country loses its presidents almost at the same time, almost in sine qua non, as it were. And we ultimately want for the person to derive their mandate from the people. So I really hold the view that we've come to a point, having learned through state capture or high levels of corruption, having seen that, let alone measurement of corruption, but we haven't dealt sufficiently with whether a department is performing or not performing.
Mmusi, that was brilliantly said. My question goes to the point that you raised, that inadvertently we do not have a very strict separation of powers between Parliament and the executive, because Parliament at the moment elects the president, which is why you are saying let's have a direct election of the president. How does the current model that favors political parties, because as you said, we have a PR system, so political parties, if they get 40% of the vote, they should get roughly 40% of the seats in the National Assembly. How does this current system affect Parliament's ability to perform oversight? And I'm asking this because of the high levels of corruption we have seen in local, provincial, and national government.
So I really do think that accountability as a framework, Parliament actually becomes ineffective in the current electoral system, because it then can ultimately be reduced down to numbers, even voting for wrongdoing or poor programs that don't always serve constituencies. I just want to add another safeguard for the electorate. At this point in time, because of party lists, South Africans are not always going to interrogate the party list. So it is very possible that you could have a decent, honest human being standing in the front of the party list, and after them, a whole bunch of crooks. The citizens would not know that, because they're not voting for the individuals in the list. They are voting for the party, which may have a veneer, a front of a decent leader, but a shell for multiple criminals. And citizens would never know that. So you almost even blindfold citizens in voting, because they just arrive and say, I'm voting for party X, but I'm unclear what sits beyond the leader. If you did a poll and asked people here, how many of you know past number 5 of each party? This is a low bar. At 5, you can, if I was listing the NC people, I'd say 1 is the president, 2 is the vice president, Paul Mashatile, 3 is Gwede is the chairperson. Tell me after 5, who comes after that? Most people don't know that, because the lists, even though are obligated to be made public and available on the website, they are not always for public consumption, and therefore people are not bothered, because what consequence do they have? As MK have done now, as a very good example. MK came to Parliament with one list. Within weeks, they changed it to another list, and they could change it again. Now, the problem with that is that if you do that, you could, even if you produce a list of decent people, but because they are not voted for by you, you just voted for the party, they could keep roving a substitution, and then could bring people who were typically unelectable, but have now come in via a substitution system. because you haven't directly voted for the person.
Sorry, could I jump in with a little example of what Mmusi was talking about? I always remember the year 2000 in eThekwini in the local government elections. A candidate in a ward in Durban North was Margaret Winter, who had been a previous mayor of Durban and an excellent mayor standing for the ANC. So she got a lot of ward votes. The last person on the ANC's party list, he was later arrested for murder. So literally, people voting for Margaret Winter did not realize that they were helping to elect a murderer because they didn't know the person at the bottom of the list.
Mmusi, I just have to start by acknowledging the remarkable work that you've done in advancing our landscape, and your leadership with BOSA has certainly sparked important conversations. My question is two-pronged. You mentioned accountability. You mentioned giving power back to the people. In a reformed system, what might, in your opinion, civic engagement look like even beyond just casting the ballot? Should we be thinking about ways to give citizens more direct influence over decision-making itself? Should perhaps after the ballot we have more referenda so that power is back into the hands of the people? But my second question really is, my evidence here, evidently being a young person, is dictated by the fact that a significant portion of young people seem to be disconnected or disillusioned with the political system. So in your view, how can we create a political environment that truly encourages young South Africans to stand for office? What barriers need to be removed to ensure that youth participation is indeed meaningful and impactful in electoral reform?
Look, first of all, I think without going into the referendum conversation and being very careful that if you've got a hammer, you don't suddenly believe everything is a nail. If you were to amend the Electoral Act and make politicians genuinely accountable to the people, the current laws actually are quite empowering to the citizen. And let me tell you how that is. In one sense, all laws in this country have to undergo public participation. It hardly ever happens because people don't know, it's too far, it's too cumbersome, it's too centralized, and they feel like the president has these Lekgotla type meetings, that when they arrive at the Lekgotla with the president, they're arriving at a party Lekgotla, which if I'm not a member of that party, then why would I go? So you will then suddenly diffuse the idea that it's party first. People would be allowed to come to public meetings with the member of parliament or provincial legislature to come and make their submissions. So immediately in the lawmaking process, you've already upended the first part, which is public participation. And that filters all the way through to local government, because even in things like integrated development plans or IDPs, people must come and make submissions. Because to your point about the lack of participation of young people, I really believe, are one of the more organized groups of people. I know people are like young people. I don't think young people are lazy. I think young people are actually quite active. They may not always be active in the political space. I think that they're active in other areas. The question we've got to figure out is how to upend the importance of the issues as it affects young people to make it tangible to them practically and make it consequential. Because young people, like anyone else, are frustrated. And one of my frustrations with the typical party system, and maybe to mirror what is going on in the US, is that even oppositional parties start to sound the same, which means people feel like even if I vote, nothing actually changes, which means they become discouraged to vote. Whereas if you said in a constituency-based public participation, etc., my voice will be heard. So that if you were, for example, a member of parliament for Stellenbosch or for Plattekloof or whatever, or Soweto, if the people of Soweto say the Eskom tariffs, we disagree with them, you as a member of parliament, even though you are not voting at NERSA in this instance, but when the appropriations comes for Eskom, you could say, I oppose this budget vote because my constituency have told me so. So now your voice is translatable into real consequential action. But at this point in time, you could sing all you like, you could do all you like. I can promise you, if the system remains the same, it is whatever the referenda law is, whatever all of any other enacted legislation, people will still feel it's inconsequential for their lives. So So to me, yes, the starting point is amending the Electoral Act. The second part is because the last barrier to why people don't succeed is because if you are a David, you are up against the Goliath of a party. And in this instance, unless you are an extraordinary person, you really end up in a space where your budget will never match that of the party. That was what was so sickening about the last part of the elections, was that even though they included independents, but they were literally making it so impossible that financially an independent was never going to match a big party. Secondly, the geographic areas were so massive that you think if you are campaigning in the Western Cape, how do you campaign in George if you live in Cape Town? How are you going to get there? What car are you going to use? It tells you that the system is stacked up against you. So to me, those barriers must be removed by making the constituency smaller, making sure people know who you are. Because if you want to do what is a very standard political practice, like door to door, it is possible to door your way through the whole constituency if the constituency is small enough. But if it becomes provincial, you will never leave Cape Town and end up in Beaufort West. It doesn't matter how good you are. You'll never do it. So I really believe we need to amend the electoral system, strengthen citizens, make it possible for them, and make sure the voice is consequential.
And directly elect the president.
If I can, this is the exciting part. And this is why political parties have feared change. Botswana has just held its election now, electing Advocate Duma Boko, who is an extraordinary younger person who's under. Now, the qualifier for president is that if you are under 60, you are young. You may not qualify in the US, you'll be too young. So the thing is, they elected him. But you know what? He had to fight in his own constituency. Other people also had to fight in their own constituencies. And as constituencies voted for a different set of MPs, there was a change in that space. Much love.
Mmusi, thank you so much. I think you encapsulated it beautifully. It's the young people think that the political elite don't care about them, so they're not going to give their time to the political elite to go vote for them. In the current system, independent candidates have to get, I believe it is 89,000 votes in order to get a parliamentary seat, whereas if they were a candidate for a political party, they would only need, I speak under correction, but I think it's 44,000 votes to get a seat. So the current electoral system is unfair towards independent candidates. Michael, as someone who has been intimately involved in the independent candidates movement and especially in the different mathematical calculations, from an independent candidate's point of view, tell us a bit more about how our current system works when it comes to independent candidates and its advantages or disadvantages.
Sure, thank you. The whole point of proportional representation is if you represent a particular interest with widespread support, that's how it works. A party then can gather little bits of support from every community all over the place, and PR is fantastic for that. So if you are an environmentalist party and you're going to get support from all over the place, spread out, no geographic community, then the party system is ideal for this election. The process leading to the inclusion of independent candidates was itself one of the things that really hampered independence, because there were long delays after the 2020 Concourt judgment, and Parliament and the minister did not act timeously, and the parliamentary process itself also took a lot longer than it should have. And this led to a great deal of uncertainty about the process, about the rules, signatures, no signatures. And that was one of the factors that significantly hampered independence for this last election. But really, what went wrong? What was called the minimalist option, the Ministerial Advisory Committee in 2021 presented two options. They called it the minimalist option. That option was so bad. I call it the cut and paste option. It's like just copy sections of how the electoral law works for parties and then just pretend that independent candidates are the same. The candidates are not parties. It just does not work like that. And that copy and paste approach that they called the minimalist thing, where they merely inserted independence into the existing system as though that was a normal and natural thing to do. And I can tell you there is no precedent for what we landed up with anywhere in the world. There is literally no precedent for it. PR is a party system. You cannot put an individual into a party system without disturbing the whole idea of proportionality. And the simple reason is one person could win enough votes for 10 seats. You then throw your proportionality out. And then in the fallout from that scenario, if it were to happen, the largest party would gain disproportionately. How do individuals participate in a system? It can't just be slap, copy, paste on top of proportional representation. It has to be a hybrid system like our local government, some form, and there's various forms, we can talk about the details. It has to be. It has to be some form of constituency system. Individuals must contest elections in constituencies where they are tied to local communities. An independent cannot contest a whole province. He cannot go town to town to town. In a constituency, an independent candidate can go street to street, suburb to suburb. That's fantastic. But the moment an independent is contesting a wide region, it just doesn't work. In a sense, he does none of it well because he cannot connect with the entire electorate. So why the current system is wrong is it is confusing individuals with parties. And that so-called minimalist include them in the existing system. So we come down, independent candidates need to be in some form of constituencies. The mechanics of how it works, I said they buried the distortions of proportionality by at least breaking down for the National Assembly that you can test the region. So any distortions are limited to the size of that region. So the numbers would not be so dramatic. And because the numbers are not so dramatic, someone like myself who's so close to how those seat allocations work, I was jumping up and down about the proportionality problem. But 1 or 2 seats out of proportion, most people just like, it's no big deal. But the consequence was, and this is what we fought and lost the Concord case on, by doing it in the regions, and they just, again, copied and pasted from the old act without thinking about it. There were only 200 seats available to independent candidates, but for the entire electorate. So instead of your however many million, instead of that being among 400 seats giving you the 44,000 votes per seat, suddenly that 17.4 million would be split among 200 seats. And because the regions are different and the way the calculations work, that varied between 68,000 as a quota and 92,000. As a quota in the different regions. Now, that's patently unfair. Now, the Concord case was rushed because Parliament took so long. And we lost that case, partly because it was so rushed. But what it hinged on, an independent has to get past a threshold of 80-odd thousand votes, and a party has to get past a threshold of 40-odd thousand to get the same seat in the National Assembly. Now, unfortunately, those matters could not be aired properly in the Concord with the rushed process. We didn't have answering affidavits in that rushed timescale, so the arguments were not explored. And the fundamental problem is PR is a system for parties across a whole region. Independents need a system that brings you down to constituencies, to local campaigning. So that is the fundamental reason that the current system can't work. Why have electoral reform? You see, how well governed we are is important to everybody in the country. Our elections are an incredibly important component of how well governed we are. If we take one step back from the immediate focus that everybody has about the politics and the power, the elections are important. Long term, the accuracy of results is critical to the survival of our democracy. The electoral system governs the relationship between the elected representatives and the electorate and the voters. Under our current system, the relationship is between the elected MPs and their party whips, or their ministers who are also the national executive members in their party. So there is an incredible deference to ministers, even in the committee work, as Mmusi put. There is this deference to the minister. And I mean, I'll give another example, this electoral reform panel that's been appointed. The previous Minister of Home Affairs was months past the deadline in the Act to appoint that panel. The panel was only appointed in May. It was due by October last year. But the committee should have been hauling him over the coals and insisting on the appointment of the panel The committee gave them the smallest of, oh dear, maybe that shouldn't have been like that. Okay, so MPs are accountable to, they are answerable to, they have a relationship with their party. And exactly as was said, the electoral system could alter the relationship between those MPs and the communities that elect them. We need a close relationship. As people observe this electoral reform process going forward, and as all the different proposals are going to be put, we are going to hear some very fine-sounding words about each system. But we have to be alert that different systems and different variations have consequences. And we're going to hear fine words, but often those fine words will mask interests. So people will say instability of coalitions. Well, some of the people saying instability of coalitions have a vested interest in the larger parties being stronger. So watch who is saying what, and be careful about the justifications. And when you are comparing alternatives, take your priorities. Fairness, the relationship, the link between communities and their elected representatives. How close is that connection? And then compare the different alternatives according to those priorities and measure them. We will have some kind of constituency system. Now, the two main variations are single-member constituencies and multi-member constituencies. But multi-member constituencies have three very particular flavors. You have what we currently use, what's called the closed list. The party sets the list, and that's it. And we've spoken about the problems of the party list. The second is an open list system. It's more complicated, but voters get to vote for the candidate within the party. So they choose their party and then choose which candidate within the party. So the electorate determines the order of the list. Now, there's advantages to that. That creates a much closer connection. And then there is the idea of the single transferable vote, where you not only vote for a person, you also give your second choice and your third choice. Now, people will hear multi-member constituencies, and for example, some people will argue for open list or single transferable vote. Now, sure, those last two create quite a big connection between the electorate and the individual representatives. But if you say, oh no, those last two add-ons are too complicated, so let's just go to multi-member constituencies with closed lists because it's nearly the same. Well, in reality, it's not nearly the same. The relationship between the MPs and the electorate gets severed if you don't have open lists. But the way discussions go, and people love compromises. So, oh dear, we would have liked this or this. Oh, but let's compromise because it sounds nearly as good. People will often just hop to the second best. But the who does the MP answer to? Whose opinions does he count most important? And then one other thing which I can throw into consider is, do you have by-elections or don't you? Somebody resigns or gets fired by their party. Does your system allow a by-election or doesn't it? Because that makes a massive difference. If you can't have by-elections, a party can fire their MP and put somebody else in who's going to be much more obedient than the first person. The most fair, most direct system is going to involve extra work and is going to involve complications. And proportionality is great because it is fairness. And in a diverse country like South Africa, as much as we need our constituency system, we also need the fairness of proportionality. If we don't have a pure or proper proportional representation system, and I would argue if we have thresholds, we exclude on the margins of our parliament those voices from a very diverse society. And I would argue that's just not what our constitution is. And what our identity as a country is.
Thank you, Michael. I loved what you said, that we will need to evaluate every system as this debate continues, because as we know, the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel is due to file their report with the new Minister of Home Affairs, Dr. Schreiber, in May 2025. So we will be hearing lots of debates about this leading up to May and probably after May. And that is also why the FW de Klerk Foundation is doing this podcast series to help us understand all the different ways that an electoral system can look. That for South Africa, we really need to focus on and prioritize whether the system we're looking at is fair and whether it gives the closest link possible between the MP and the voters who voted for that MP, because we will end up with a hybrid system. Currently, we have the proportional system, which ensures a lot of fairness and minority voices being heard. but we completely throw out any direct link between voters and the MPs, because the MPs are rather directly linked to the party. And that has led to a whole host of problems.
Michael said that individual or independent do not have the financial means to advocate for themselves in order to compete for the seats in the National Assembly. So, Michael, how do you propose, or what should be done in order for the independents to be able to compete fairly with the parties?
It's a great question. And there's actually two factors. Mmusi also said smaller constituencies. If you have a geographical area, an independent candidate can go and literally tramp the streets. But there's another change that would transform the landscape for independent candidates. If you de-link the constituency ballot from the PR party ballot, then you naturally get far fewer candidates in the constituency. But then that becomes a more meaningful local race. So I'm going to look at the candidates, and I'm going to say, I don't care what party the candidates are from, who is the best candidate? Now, in that scenario, an independent candidate who is well known by his community suddenly has an incredibly good shot. Then people might say, look, I'll support the party in the PR ballot, but let me vote for the best candidate in the constituency election. So smaller constituencies and splitting off the constituency vote from the party overall calculations would transform the landscape for independent candidates and would give them a realistic chance of being elected. We do need to keep thinking about our constitutional values. A lot of arguments are made on practical arguments. Oh, here's a problem. We don't like that problem, so let's make a rule against it. But the people doing that are not starting from our constitutional values, our right to vote, our right to fair elections, our right to make political choices, our right to dignity. And we must evaluate every system or every rule that varies a system against those fundamental constitutional values. We need to make sure, whatever system we have, that each vote counts the same. Votes must be worth the same. Each voter must have the same dignity as every other voter. The ballot booth is the one place where we are equal in this country.
Thank you so much to both of our esteemed guests. It's been very enlightening talking about our current electoral system and its problems, both from a political party perspective and from the perspective of independent candidates. All of these viewpoints have been really enlightening. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for in today's podcast. However, if the topic of electoral reform has piqued your interest, please continue to keep an eye out as the Foundation continues with this series about why our electoral system needs to change, what the problems with it is, and why it is important. Thank you so much. Until next time.